Coming up on Car Advice, we pit the new Toyota Corolla Hybrid against the Volkswagen Golf Trendline to see how Toyota's new tech leader fares against Volkswagen's long-time benchmark.
Beautiful brute or stunning SUV? We hit the streets in the revamped Porsche Macan S.
And political turmoil, finance guru Ross Greenwood joins the panel to share his thoughts on how the federal election will influence new car prices.
Welcome to Car Advice. I'm Trent, Nikolic. Thank you for joining us again. Another big week in automotive, and we've got a favourite here, the small car segment, one of the toughest in Australia, Toyota Corolla Hybrid versus Volkswagen Golf Trendline. We'll have a look at the Porsche Macan S, stepping things up a little bit to that premium SUV in the medium segment there. And Channel 9 business expert Ross Greenwood will join us on the panel to talk about the upcoming federal election and new car pricing. Before that, Paul Maric joining me at the desk. Hello, mate.
Hello, Trent. How are you?
Good. I'm really good. Let's get started with the Fast and the Furious, shall we? Honda Civic Type R police car. Is this a joke or is it actually real?
Unfortunately not. Yeah. No, I'm kidding. That's the thing. It's one of these, they call it a community liaison car. So it's a car that gets around in the community. It doesn't have a siren, it doesn't have lights, it doesn't have a radio, but it can respond to situations if required.
I will say one thing though, I think this move away from the traditional Holden and Ford product that the police used has really opened the door to this kind of thing. I mean, I know we've seen a whole bunch of different cars. We're seeing all manner of other product dressed up as police cars. I think the Public Order and Riot Squad in New South Wales use Ram pickup trucks as well. So they're going to all different manufacturers now and saying, give us some product and we'll go out there and sticker it up and talk to the public.
But what do you reckon? I mean, they say it's a community liaison car. It's there to start a conversation with people on the street.
Yep.
Is it kind of promoting the wrong image?
I mean, well, you could ask that question. I mean, it's a fast performance car, a hot hatch. Is that the image they want?
Well, how does just a standard police car not promote that same conversation starter? So I don't really understand that, but you know, more power to them. I love seeing these cars dressed up as police cars. They kind of look pretty cool, I reckon.
Advice at caradvice.com. Let us know what you think. Does it make any sense for them to interact with the public this way, and do these cars create any extra impact? Well, this is an interesting one, mate. Audi has recently apologised for the Dieselgate scandal.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, isn't that nice? Now, I would have thought that that'd be the least that you could have done.
This is the thing. I mean, they've come out and Audi chairman Bram Schott has said, believe me, it was a shock that to all of us when our CEO Rupert Stadler was arrested. Yep. And they went on further to say, we all agree here at Audi that something like the diesel crisis should never happen again, and it will never happen again, and I say this very clearly, never again. Now, it's fair enough to come out and say it's never going to happen again, but the fact of the matter is they would have said 10 years ago that, oh, this will never happen.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
Obviously, a group of, they claim rogue engineers, but clearly here there is some senior management involvement, because we do know, especially at these German companies, a rogue engineer can't just go and change things without telling anyone, because there's no benefit to their job to do that.
No, it doesn't happen.
So it's quite clear that there is, you know, a bigger picture at play here. They are trying to save face, but it does raise the question, what is going to be the next big scandal and how many manufacturers will be involved?
And look, the point you make there is an interesting one. I think this speaks to a bigger issue within the motoring manufacturing industry, that this rabid push to lower emissions standards, lowering fuel usage. What do you expect? You know, if a CEO of a car company walks into an engineering department and says this vehicle must get to this level of emission,
and you say to them, sorry, so we have these laws of physics and it's not possible.
That's not possible. And he says, that's good, you got 48 hours to make it work. What are the engineers supposed to do? So I think you're going to continue to have this problem while we're making manufacturers stick to unrealistic goals. So look, I think it's a big issue in the manufacturing industry, and I think it's going to be happening more. Advice at caradvice.com. I'd love to hear from you about whether this impacted your decision to buy a Volkswagen Group product. When this first happened, were you about to buy a Volkswagen Group product? You decided not to. Advice at caradvice.com. Well, our final news story tonight, mate, this is one we could spend hours talking about. Australians have a real issue whenever you suggest that they may need to be retested for their licences. It's my opinion that Australians forget that a licence is a privilege, not a right. I think that as drivers, we should all have to maintain a certain standard. A recent report has suggested that elderly drivers should be put forward for retesting, and this always creates division. Sometimes you get drivers saying, you know what, I'm okay with that. I'm good. I'm happy to, you know, be up to a certain standard. Others saying, why should I be tested again? But I think the fact that you can get your licence at 17 or 18 and never be tested again, I think is a bit of a problem in Australia.
So Trent, this is a flame retardant suit because probably going to cop it.
We're going to cop it.
To say. But I did an opinion piece exactly on this, that older drivers need to be retested, and I copped it left, right, and centre. But the statistics have come out and said that 12% of all fatalities are now made up by elderly drivers, despite the fact they represent only 6% of licence holders. They still aren't in the position of younger drivers, which represent 13.8% of fatalities, but they're getting damn close. And the thing that really troubles me, this is the analogy I use, would you get on a plane, put the Boeing Max 8 to the side, but would you get on a plane with a pilot that got their pilot licence at 17 and never once got tested again?
And they're 60 years of age.
Of course you wouldn't. I would not set foot on that plane. So why is it okay that people on our roads can get a licence once, never have to go through road rules again, never have to be tested again, and then pass on all their crap habits to people they teach how to drive?
Advice at CarAdvice.com. Please send us an email and let us know why we're right and why everybody should be periodically retested. You've heard us talk a lot on the show about dual cab utes because, you know, have we ever mentioned dual cab?
We've mentioned it once or twice.
Once or twice, in the last, exactly. But there's a battleground that used to be the most traditional real boxing ring, really, in new car sales in Australia, and that's small cars. So this twin test is a really interesting one. We've put the Corolla Hybrid up against the Volkswagen Golf Trendline. And I think the critical element and the thing to point out right from the beginning is the Corolla Hybrid, depending on which specification grade you like, is our smart pick in that range. We actually think the hybrid's the one to buy. So this is a really interesting comparison.
It is, and it kind of cements what I've been talking about recently, that these small cars are becoming very premium very quickly.
Yeah, they are.
It used to be a 19,990 thing for your Hyundai i30, Kia Cerato. Now what we're finding is cars like the Golf, the Corolla, the Focus, they're all starting around that $25,000 mark. And these two here, you look at them and you're like, oh, they just look like entry levels. They're about $28,000. So it is a fair asking price here. And then it troubles me further when you look at Volkswagen, for example. They charge you $1,500 for a driver assistance pack, which has basic features like rear cross traffic alert. But I thought stuff like that should be standard these days. And it also then brings further into question how Toyota can cram that Corolla full of all the standard safety aids and a hybrid drive for the same price.
And look, you mentioned some of the competitive set there, but if you're at home wondering why we're saying this is competitive, you've got to throw in Hyundai, Kia and Honda and Mazda into that segment. And that's before you start looking at things like Audi and BMW and Mercedes at the more premium end of the pricing spectrum. So this battleground is probably more competitive in terms of options than it's ever been. Now let's have a look at the Toyota Corolla first of all, because as I said from the outset, I think the hybrid is the one that you buy. The reason is it has real-world efficiency. So I tested this thing, not this exact hybrid, but one of the hybrids, in traffic in Sydney without any highway running, and it was averaging low 4 litres per 100 kilometres. So that's in the real world, using hardly any fuel while it's sitting around in traffic going nowhere. That is extremely efficient. And what that shows is that Toyota really, probably more than any manufacturer, really has its hybrid drivetrain system down pat. They've got it running nicely and it's very, very smooth.
Yeah, they do. And if you look at the power figures here, it's actually a really impressive package because they couple quite a small engine, 72 kilowatts, 142 kilowatts of power. But then they throw in that hybrid drivetrain, which adds an extra 53 kilowatts of power, and it uses a nickel metal hydride battery there to store that energy for you to use later. And then fuel consumption of about 4 litres per 100. But as good as Toyota's hybrid system is, Volkswagen has also developed a turbocharged petrol system that's just as good with 110 kilowatts of power. The Golf has plenty of punch. It's a really nice, civilised package to drive. But ultimately, it's the gearbox that lets the Golf down. And we say this continuously. A dual-clutch gearbox is designed generally for sports cars. That's where it all started. Now, manufacturers see an 8 to 10% efficiency gain from dual-clutch gearboxes. And what they do is they fit them to these small cars because it's an easy way to trim 10% off that fuel consumption figure. But it comes at the cost of drivability.
It does come at the cost of drivability. And this is where it gets interesting because we've said, for a while, we've said that we don't love CVTs. So constantly variable transmission is another way of using an automatic style gearbox, but in a more efficient way in terms of fuel usage. We don't love them. However, in the way that they've adapted it at Toyota to the Corolla Hybrid, it's excellent. So I'd put that down as a real benefit as to where the Corolla's at. Also, too, another little one is that the Corolla can run on 91 RON fuel, whereas the Golf needs 95. But let's look at some of the Golf strong points. For the price point that we're testing here, you do get a really premium package. It feels like a pretty expensive car. You said that about both of them, especially the case with the Volkswagen. And for a lot of people, a Golf is still an aspirational small car. So to think that you can get into a Golf for this kind of spend is quite a positive thing for buyers, isn't it?
Correct, and that's the thing. Let's have a look at interiors here. Interior is where it all starts turning towards the Golf in terms of favour, because in the Golf you're getting Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, all the techie fun things. You're not getting that in Corolla, despite the fact it's available in Toyotas overseas. And for some bizarre reason, Toyota's gone, all right, so Corolla has plenty of room inside. What we'll now do is make it the exact opposite. So there's literally no rear leg room.
Tiny.
The boot is tiny, and it's made even tinier because you've got a hybrid drivetrain there. So it is a little disappointing that they've gone down that path, but ultimately for me, if I was looking between these two cars, it's still the Corolla I'd go for. I mean, that shared platform now they use is sensational. The car is beautiful to drive. It shares a similar platform to the Prius, which we've praised for its drivability. Volkswagen still has a very plush setup there. It's good to drive as well. But if it was my money, I'd be tipping it towards that Corolla. It just seems like a better value car at that price. Yeah,
I'd have to agree with you. Corolla for me as well. CarAdvice.com if you want to read the full review. And just quickly, the overall wash-up, we've given them 8.5 each out of 10. It's good for both vehicles, and it shows you how competitive this segment really is. Kurt Dupre recently sampled the all-new 2019 Porsche Macan, and at launch, Paul, without the whole range available, he focused his time on the S. And I think there's a couple of things to note from the outset here. I think the Macan still sets the standard as the most sporting SUV to drive and to own. There's been plenty of pretenders to that throne since Macan came about, but I still think Macan sits there as the one that that wins that battle. And even though we're looking at the S here, which is a more premium variant, Kurt and I had this conversation in the Sydney office a couple of weeks back that Porsche really doesn't do cheap. They don't really do entry level. You know, even their more affordable cars, whether you look at a Cayenne or a Macan, you sit in it, you close the door shut, still feels like you're in a Porsche, and it doesn't feel cheap, does it?
And you know why they do that? Because if you have a cheap Porsche, it looks cheap. So
That's
if you
right,
buy one with the standard wheels it comes with, they kind of look crap. So you have to spend that extra money and ultimately people go ahead and do all this stuff. And the key feature that stands out here for me before we have a look at this car, Porsche offers a thing called Sport Chrono. And that's a package that adds dynamic engine mounts and a couple of other bits and pieces. But to me, the $29.50 you spend on it is actually all just for that clock that's mounted to the dashboard.
It is, absolutely.
So it acts as a clock but also a stopwatch, and it is just the most beautiful thing.
Beautiful piece of engineering. It really is, absolutely. Now, I think there's a couple of things to look at here. There's a lot of the new Macan that's familiar to the old Macan, so that's worth saying. However, the infotainment's all new. And in typical Porsche fashion, they've spent a hell of a lot of time and engineering now on this infotainment system. And to our mind, at least, it's a very premium system that works really well.
Well, thankfully, because the last one was crap. I mean,
it was pretty awful,
Their
wasn't it?
infotainment systems were so bad previously that you'd look at them and go, this just does not look in place in this car, given the rest of it. They've now gone so above and beyond the previous generation. They've added Apple CarPlay, and it's just a functional, beautiful thing to use. But Trent, I'm a bit troubled with the back of this car. It looks ugly. I don't know.
But styling's subjective. People think you're ugly and they're wrong.
Correct.
You're clearly wrong.
I had to think about that for a second.
So you think that's ugly and you're wrong. No, look, just before you move on to the styling, though, let's have a look at some of the additions on that infotainment. So 10.9-inch touchscreen, which replaces the old 7.2-inch screen, and that goes to what you were saying. It was already out of date long before. This new one's got razor-sharp resolution, really, really good. It's got all the new Porsche Connect trickery, so it's got online enhanced navigation, web radio, intelligent voice control, app-based smartphone, car-to-car communication. You mentioned Apple CarPlay and Android Auto mirroring. It's all standard fitment in this S, and we've done a video of how all that stuff works. So go to caradvice.com and have a look at that video. But I think if you're spending almost $100,000 in this segment, I think you want all that equipment standard, don't you? You'd expect it to be there.
Exactly. You know, the biggest issue with the Macan, though, and that's the Audi SQ5.
Oh, yeah, it's such a good platform, isn't it?
It is. So obviously it's shared here with the Macan. The engine's virtually shared as well. Under the bonnet, it uses a 3-litre turbocharged V6. Now, the old engine was a twin turbocharged V6. The new one is a twin scroll single turbocharged V6.
Yeah.
It makes 260 kilowatts of power, which is 10 up on the previous one. 480 newton meters of torque, which is 20 more than the previous one. It'll do 0 to 100 in under 6 seconds. So all of that adds up very nicely. But the problem is it's all very much shared with the SQ5, and the new SQ5 is so good that I don't know that you could justify the price jump to this car, because they're quite matched in terms of infotainment systems and features. The way they drive, ride and handle is obviously better in the Porsche, but you're close enough there with the SQ5. But ultimately, the SQ5 doesn't have a Porsche badge or a Porsche key.
It doesn't have a Porsche badge, exactly. And look, just before we go on to that bit, the other thing too there with all those numbers, combined fuel use reading of 8.9 litres
That's
per 100.
amazing, isn't it?
That is impressive for a vehicle that's capable of this performance. And then I think we move to what you're talking about there. What price the premium for a Porsche badge? I think a lot of people are going to justify it because they see this as a special car.
Yeah.
And I think even though, you know, the Audi SQ5 is a brilliant vehicle and we love it, this does look a little bit special. I know you said you don't like the rear styling. Some people will love it. It kind of now looks a bit more like a baby Cayenne to me at the rear, which is not a bad thing, but they haven't messed with the front of it, because I've always thought the front of the Macan
looks great.
really, really good, whereas the Cayenne can look a little tall. So I think that styling there is really important. I think it's done a really good job. But I think buyers are looking at this going, you know what, this is actually an affordable Porsche. And then you add in the fact that nothing about it feels cheap. It's a win-win, isn't it?
Okay, so let's put the Macan S to the side. There's other options that are coming as well. So there's an entry-level 4-cylinder, which seems to have done really well, because at the starting price of $80,000, it's an easy way to get into a Porsche. For people that don't want to spend mega bucks, they may not care about the way it drives or handles, so they're happy to go with the 2-litre option, and it means they get that Porsche badge. There will be a Macan Turbo, which sits above the S, but uses a similar engine coming as well. And given that the previous Macan also had a GTS, we could even see like a Turbo S variant, which would be kind of cool, because they've done GT4 in the Cayman. There is a new GT4 coming. I don't see why they can't go and zazz this up a bit as well.
Well, advice at caradvice.com. I'd love to hear some feedback from you, because I had a really interesting conversation with a Macan owner the other day who told me that him and his wife together, they would have been hot hatch buyers. So they probably would have previously been a Golf R buyer, that kind of market. They decided to go with a Macan because they see it as a hot hatch almost, but with all that extra storage. So advice at caradvice.com. Let us know what you think. Would you fork out the 100 grand for the Macan S to get that Porsche badge in your driveway? Now, unless you've been living under a rock for the past 12 months or so, you'd be aware that we've got a federal election coming up. Joining us on the panel, Ross Greenwood, business editor at Channel 9, host of Money News on 2GB. Mate, thank you for being here. Real privilege to have you back. Now, we've got a question for you. Does it really matter who gets elected in terms of buying a new car, where you're in the market? Should you hold off? Should you wait till after the election? Because we're starting to get that question.
The real answer is, on the face of it, no. But when you start to delve into it a little bit, maybe. And maybe the answer is you should probably try and get in before the election. Now, I'd suggest there is a couple of key factors here. Number one, you've got to remember that the shadow treasurer, Chris Bowen, tried when he was previously the treasurer to get through a change in rules on novated leases.
Yes, that's right.
Now, this was highly controversial. It caused a massive backlash from the car industry and from consumers alike. Now, you'd sit there and think that this is a very much driven sort of, if you like, political party. They got views about capital gains tax, they got views about negative gearing, they got views about, say, for example, dividend imputation, shares, credits back, tax credits back. And you just imagine that maybe in the back of his mind, he hasn't forgotten that very bruising encounter that he had with the car industry at that time. Now, there's a few bits and pieces there. I'd suggest the interesting one, I think, is also luxury car tax. Now, luxury car tax was put in as a means of being able to protect Australia's local car manufacturing industry.
Which we don't do anymore, do we?
Which we don't do anymore. But we still have the tax and they still collect it. Now, I sit there and go, well, hang on, is that fair? So, you know, my gut feel is better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. So going into any federal election, make your decisions, try and stick to them. And I think also, in particular, the only thing that might make you hold back is if you think the housing market is going to continue to deteriorate.
Yep.
Generally, the car market and the housing market go hand in glove.
Yep.
So when housing prices are going up, car sales are generally better off because people feel better about it. But what you'd find is if that's the case, then maybe some of the prices on new cars are going to be that little bit worse off after the federal election.
Well, the thing that comes to mind here, and viewers at home will understand this as well, with the luxury car tax, has there ever been a precedent where the government has taken away something that generates so much money? Because to us, it makes perfect sense that we don't need the tax anymore, but it's in the order of over $100 million they're getting each year. Can they survive with that?
No, they're not going to take that away under any circumstances. And the reason is because, again, it's perceived to be a tax on the wealthy.
Yeah.
If you believe the polls and Labor's going to get in, you can't imagine them lifting a tax on the wealthy, people who can afford to pay cars. The problem, as we recently have discovered as we've looked into it, is the number of people who can avoid the luxury car tax simply by going out and buying a ute or a trade type vehicle, which doesn't hit the capital gains, the luxury car tax. Well, that's now growing, which may be one of the reasons for the explosion in ute sales in Australia, where you've got things like the Toyota Hilux and the Ford Ranger as the top-selling cars in Australia right now. Now, you've got to sit there and think that it's funny, isn't it? Because look at the price of vehicles. The price of a Mazda 3 at about 22 grand is exactly the same price as it was 20 years ago.
It is,
What's the other one I've seen? Is let's say the Mercedes C63 AMG at about 150, 160 grand is exactly the same price as it was 20 years ago. Both of them significantly better cars. So the fact of the matter is that you look at the price of a Ford or Toyota Ute as compared with 20 years ago, and they would have been 20, 25 grand then. They're now upwards of 50, getting on towards 60 grand.
And spend 75 grand on a Ranger Raptor.
That's right. So as a result, you might be avoiding the luxury car tax by buying one of those, but by gee, you're paying a bigger premium now as compared with what you were paying previously. So this is all to play for. Now, remember the other thing also is that if you go further forward, you are likely to see coming out of the Royal Commission further imposts on car dealers, in particular on finance.
That's what we were going to ask you. That's going to have a big effect, isn't it?
It's got to.
Has to, right.
Because remember that when you walked in to buy a car, the car dealer could trim the margin. So long as you took out the insurance, so long as you took out the financing, so long as you actually took out some of the extras that went with
mats.
it, the mats, the whole sort of thing. So it was the life of car that it was all about. Well, the truth is, if the government and via the Royal Commission are going to clamp down on car dealers, and the ACCC is doing the same thing, then you've got a situation where maybe some of the areas where car dealers previously made more money is going to be trimmed. There's going to be some pressure inside those car dealerships, which could come post the election.
Well, do you reckon now is a bad time to be a car dealer? I mean, you have a look at all these things coming out of the Commission into royal banking. You have a look at a lot of people buying a lot of things online now as well. Less people are walking through dealerships. Do you reckon they're doing it tough at the moment?
I think they are. And I think it actually comes down to the lack of sales coming through the door. We can see that sales are falling after having years of having sales rising as interest rates came down, as housing prices in the major capital cities went up. You suddenly saw a period where they had a bonanza. There were people literally walking to car dealerships, walking away with prestige vehicles for the very first time. You look at the fleet of Australia's cars, it's now getting younger, and so that's happening. I'd suspect with the pressure inside families right now, the fleet of cars is going to get older. It's going to change over a period of time. We know that there's been a big move away from the traditional sedan into the four-wheel drives, SUVs and so forth. The thing that may save the car dealers, particularly those out in the Western and Queensland, is the fact that the mining industry is coming back in a big way. Iron ore prices are higher. You've got a lot more projects potentially going ahead. And as a result, those sales of those utilities that really sort of picked up during the mining boom could continue for some of those people. So that's the area it could actually go to. But if you come all the way back to the car dealer in the big metropolitan areas, I think it's a bit more of a struggle now. And I think potentially you're not going to see as many car dealers in 5 years' time as what you're seeing right now, because I think there's genuine pressures building on their financing, on the way in which they do business through new laws, plus also on consumer demand, which is now starting to struggle as a result of falling house prices.
Well, there you go. Advice at caradvice.com. If you're a car dealer and you're out there and doing it tough and you agree with what we're saying, let us know. If you're seeing the other side of the equation, send us an email and let us know. Ross, thanks for joining us.
No problems at all.
Real privilege to have you here again. Thanks, mate. Well, Paul, I just came up with a good idea while Ross was here in that segment.
Yep.
Let's have him here every week.
I don't know that he'd want that.
Well, he can do our job for us. He was very good at it. We've run out of time, guys. That's all we've got time for. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.
Thank you for watching at home. We will see you again same time next week, 7:30 p.m. Wednesday nights on Your Money.